On the 20th of July 1968, a small fishing boat called the Fausto was due to set sail from La Palma in the Canary Islands, heading to Hierro Island, which was a roughly 50-mile journey. This was a routine trip for the experienced crew, and one that they had made many times before. Although the boat was technically a fishing boat, the vessel's relatively large size, at 14 metres, meant that it could also be used to ferry cargo between the islands, and this is what the three-man crew had been tasked with that day. As the sun began to settle into the ocean, the three men made quick work of loading their cargo, which, for this trip, would be crates of explosives to be used in agriculture. After this, they set sail, and after a routine and uneventful 7 hours, they arrived at their destination on the northern side of El Hierro, a small town called Frontera. They unloaded their cargo and began preparing for their return trip, ensuring that they had enough food and water to last them the 7 or so hours it would take them to make the journey back home. As they did this, a distraught-looking man approached them, and after getting their attention, he begged them to let him hitch a ride back to La Palma with them, offering them money in return. The man was desperate to return home, as his baby daughter was extremely unwell. There was a passenger boat that made trips from Frontera to Tazacorte in La Palma, but he had just missed one, and the next one would not leave for another 2 days. 2 days that he was not willing to wait. The crew of the Fausto, having families of their own and understanding the man's plight, decided to help him and welcomed him aboard, ignoring his offer of payment. And at around 2:30 AM on the 21st of July, the 4 men sailed off into the ocean, heading for their homes in Tazacorte. None of them would ever make it home. The crew of the Fausto consisted of 47-year-old Ramon Hernandez and his younger brother, 42-year-old Eliberto. Normally, they would be accompanied by their cousins, Miguel and Viterbo Acosta, 43 and 41 respectively. However, for this specific trip, only Miguel was with them, as Viterbo had prior engagements. Despite being a member down, the 3 men should not have had any problems sailing from one island to the other. They had done this trip many times before, and they were all very experienced sailors. The man who had hitched a ride with them was 27-year-old Julio Garcia, a mechanic who had recently started working on El Hierro but lived in Tazacorte with his wife and 2 children. The weather was good and the sea was calm. A light fog settled over the water as early morning approached, but this should not have been any cause for concern with such an experienced crew on board. The Fausto was due to arrive in Tazacorte at around 10 AM, but the fishing vessel never appeared. The owner of the Fausto, a man named Rafael, assumed that there must have been some sort of mechanical issue with the boat, so he sent another one of his boats out, following the same route as the Fausto, in hopes that they would bump into each other. However, the second boat sailed all the way across to Frontera and couldn't find any signs of the missing boat or its crew. When he still hadn't heard anything on the following day, fearing for the safety of the men and under pressure from the families, Rafael contacted authorities, who immediately began plotting out search areas and sending out radio messages to all ships in the area to be on the lookout. The Fausto was officially considered lost at sea, and so a bomber plane from another of the Canary Islands, Gran Canaria, took off at around midday to get an aerial view of the search area. Weather conditions were perfect for a search, sunny with no clouds, but despite this, the plane found no trace of the missing boat. Several more planes would fly above the area in the following days, but none of them would find any clues as to the location or fate of the fishing vessel. Many ships and small boats were also used to search the waters between and around the islands, but they too would find nothing. It was like the Fausto had simply vanished. The families of the missing men began to fear the worst as time ticked on. They knew that the crew would only have packed enough provisions to last them for a very short time, as they were expecting to be back home just a few hours after leaving Frontera. They had a small amount of water and some fruit on board, which would not have lasted long between the 4 of them. Around this time, 2 to 3 days after the boat had disappeared, the authorities began to assume that it and the crew had sunk, and that was why they hadn't found any trace of it, despite the extensive search. Then, on the 25th of July, roughly 120 miles away from La Palma, a British ship named the Duchess sent out a radio message claiming to have come across a drifting fishing boat. And, after providing the call sign, TE21268, it was confirmed that this boat was indeed the Fausto. The boat was miles off course, but amazingly, all 4 men were still alive, despite being stranded at sea in blistering heat with little provisions for 4 days. Not only were they alive, but they seemed to be in fairly good shape given their ordeal. The crew of the Duchess encouraged the dehydrated men to board their ship and allow them to tow the Fausto back to land, assuming that the vessel had incurred some sort of damage or breakdown, which would explain how they had drifted to their current location. Strangely, however, the 4 men refused to be towed, claiming that there was nothing wrong with the Fausto and that they just needed fuel. Those aboard the Duchess spent several hours trying to convince the men that it would be better to come with them back to land, but the 4 stubbornly stood their ground, insisting that they just needed fuel and that they would make their own way back home. Many witnesses aboard the Duchess would later say that the 4 men seemed shaken by their ordeal, but they were coherent and holding themselves together well. Their mental states appeared to be fine, which is generally not what you would expect from a group that had just experienced a 4-day-long near-death experience. This did strike some of them as odd, but eventually they gave up trying to convince the 4 men and instead granted their request. They provided the Fausto with plenty of fuel, along with food and water, and watched as the boat headed out towards La Palma. The Duchess sent a radio message to Tazacorte informing them that the Fausto would reach them by around 7 PM that night. Of course, this led to a rush of relief and excitement to wash through the town, and people began to gather at the docks, including the families of the Fausto's crew. The town celebrated and partied all the way up to 7 PM, when everyone turned their attention to the horizon, waiting to see the shape of the small fishing boat come into view. But as time ticked by and no boat appeared, the mood of the crowd began to drop. A few boats went out to see if they could spot the Fausto, thinking that perhaps they were just running a little behind schedule, but none of them returned with good news. The Fausto had vanished once again. The family stayed stood on the docks all night, but eventually returned to their homes, devastated. What followed was, at the time, the largest missing persons operation in Spain's history. More bomber planes were used in the search, along with Grumman albatrosses and Douglas DC-4s. All of them found nothing. The searches continued until the 7th of August, when the operation was called off, and the Fausto was officially listed as lost at sea once more. By October, the Fausto and its crew had been mostly forgotten about by anyone not directly linked to the missing men. The families had now accepted that they had perished at sea, and they were all just trying to move forward with their lives as best as they could. Then, on the morning of the 9th of October, an Italian ship called the Anna di Maio, which was heading to Venezuela, came across a drifting fishing boat in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The crew immediately knew that something was wrong, as this was not the type of boat built for long trips out to sea, and so they made the decision to board the seemingly empty boat. As they pulled up alongside the small boat, the call sign could clearly be seen. It read, TE21268. The boat they had found was the Fausto. 2 men from the Anna di Maio climbed aboard and looked around apprehensively. The boat rocked back and forth, the sound of the water slapping against it the only noise coming from the apparently empty vessel. They couldn't see any obvious damage, and there didn't seem to be a logbook on board that could have been used to figure out the boat's last movements. After finding nothing on deck, one of the men, named Luciano, decided that he should check the engine room to see if that held any clues as to what had happened. He opened the hatch and dropped down into the room below. What he found made him freeze, and he had to fight the urge to turn and immediately leave the room. Lay in the middle of the engine room, face up and naked, was the partially mummified remains of a man. Luciano took a deep breath to steady himself and called out to his crewmate, informing him of what he had found and asking him to pass the information back to the Anna di Maio so that they could radio the authorities. Once he had managed to calm his nerves somewhat, he decided to have a look around the engine room, searching for anything to explain what had happened. He didn't find much out of place, but he did come across a notebook which had clearly had several of its pages removed. He flipped through it and didn't come across anything that jumped out at him until he reached the final used page in the book, which was just after the torn out section. Rather than the simple short notes and calculations he had seen on previous pages, this page seemed to be a letter of some sort. Luciano was unable to read its contents as it had been written in Spanish, but he did recognise that it likely belonged to the deceased man, and so it was worth taking with him. He returned to the Anna di Maio shortly after finding the notebook, along with a few documents he had found on board the boat. Then, after informing the authorities of their intentions, they began to tow the Fausto behind them, continuing on to their original destination of Venezuela. Back in La Palma, there was some hope that they would finally have an answer as to what had happened to the missing crew of the Fausto. Although only one body had been found, perhaps they would also be able to find some clues to indicate what had befallen the other men. However, just 2 days after the Anna de Mayo had found the drifting boat, they again contacted authorities to inform them that the Fausto had sunk during the night, and it had snapped the tow line in the process, meaning that they no longer had the boat, or the body aboard it. This would be the third and final time that the Fausto would be lost at sea. Without the boat and its contents, the notebook and the other paperwork that Luciano had gathered were the only evidence investigators had to work with. The paperwork ended up being mostly insurance documents, and so were of little use. The notebook, however, held a little more information. Now in the hands of someone that could understand fully what was written on the final page, it was quickly revealed that the notebook had belonged to Julio Garcia, the man who had hitched a ride on the Fausto. The text was a letter he had written to his wife. In the letter, Julio told his wife not to tell their young son everything that had happened to him, and that God had wanted this fate for him. The letter also contained instructions on how to financially support herself and their children, using his insurance money and by selling his assets. This makes it very clear that he knew he was not going to make it back home. Although the note told investigators that Julio was aware of his situation and coherent enough to write a goodbye message to his wife, it did not give any explanation for what actually happened. Investigators and the families were left with many questions. How had they initially ended up off course? Why hadn't they accepted help from the Duchess? Especially since Julio had been desperate to get back home to his sick daughter. What happened once they parted with the Duchess? And where were the bodies of the 3 crew members? Remember how Julio's notebook had obviously had pages ripped out? Well, it is speculated that he could have been keeping a log of the Fausto's and his own final movements. The question is, who removed the pages, and why? There are many theories as to what happened to them. Some speculated that the men had been trying to escape to Venezuela, others say that they had been smuggling illegal cargo and pirates had attacked them. Or that Julio, being the only different element to this trip, had in fact had something to do with the demise of the Fausto and its crew. These theories hold little weight, however, since the crew of the fishing boat all had stable family lives and they were not struggling financially, which seems to provide little motive for them to either run away or be involved in illegal smuggling. Not to mention the fact that the Fausto could not hold enough fuel to get them across the ocean, and the crew would have known that. As for Julio, his story about having a very sick baby daughter was investigated and found to be true, so his story also seems to check out. It is more likely that the Fausto was suffering from some kind of technical issue that prevented the men from navigating properly, although it's unlikely that the experienced crew would not have noticed such an issue, especially as they drifted off course and didn't arrive at their destination at the scheduled time. Assuming that they didn't realise that something was amiss in time, their apparent calm demeanour and insistence on sailing home on their own could actually have been the result of extreme stress and dehydration. Under these circumstances, it's quite possible that the men would have been disorientated and unable to think about their situation rationally. They may have felt that something was wrong, but not known what, and this may have manifested itself in distrust in the crew of the Duchess. After they left the Duchess, the same malfunction, along with the reduced capabilities of the men, could have resulted in them again missing their destination and instead heading out into the Atlantic. What happened after that point is anyone's guess. The men, in their confusion, could have turned on the only non-blood relative on the boat, but as he was younger than them, he could have fought them off and dumped them overboard to protect himself. Although, this would have left him stranded as he didn't know how to operate a boat and thus would have sealed his own fate. It is also possible that the men could have jumped off the boat themselves. It seems unlikely, but people can do strange things when in extreme situations, especially if they're feeding off of each other's fear and paranoia. However, if the men were so deep into a stress-induced mental break, then how was Julio able to write such a concise letter to his wife, detailing how she should go about accessing his finances? Perhaps he had a moment of clarity towards the end, one last burst of awareness after days of confusion and nonsensical thoughts. Maybe he grasped at that moment of lucidity just long enough to write his final thoughts and try and ensure that his wife and children will be looked after in his absence. Then, as his mind began to grow fuzzy again, he lay down on the floor, his dehydrated and malnourished body unable to support his weight any longer. And that is where he would remain, swaying with the boat as it drifted aimlessly. While there are many stories and theories surrounding the Fausto and the 4 men aboard it, we will probably never truly know what happened, its secrets kept safe, somewhere on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to the channel and leave a comment down below with any suggestions for future videos. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again next time.